In this lesson, we're going to look at one of the modes of multimodal learning, and that's technology. Before we move on, I want you to think about a couple of questions though. How important do you think technology really is in 21st century education? And how much time should teachers devote to using technology? I think most people would answer in the affirmative. Yes, we need to use lots of technology. In fact, we don't really have a lot of choice these days, do we? But I want you to think about something else and see if you can relate to this. When I used to walk through the halls of my school, I'd see a lot of students on Chromebooks and other devices that the teachers asked them to use. But I also saw a lot of faces that looked like this, bored and disengaged. Why do you think that is? I think there's two really good reasons why we see faces like that. First of all, I think a lot of us are still doing things the way we used to, just with a little flashier technology. So, if we used to give students a worksheet to complete a task, we do so via Google Docs or Google Classroom. And if we used to assign chapter questions where we had them read a story or an article or whatever and answer questions, the piece of paper has become the Chromebook. Same thing, different technology. The other thing is that so many of us are embracing technology and using it in our classrooms that students don't get a lot of variety in their day-to-day life in school. And then they go home and they're on screens as well. So there's not a lot of freedom from monotony. Everything is good in moderation, but too much can create boredom. I really like this quotation. Classrooms don't need tech geeks who can teach. We need teaching geeks who can use tech. And what that means is we don't have to be these technological wizards. We do need to be really good at teaching and using teaching strategies. And if we can layer in some technology to enhance those, that's a bonus. And before we go any further, I don't want you to panic as I go through this stuff, because in the last module of this lesson, this part of the course, I'm going to give you some tips and some strategies that you can use to enhance technology or enhance the education in your classroom using technology. So before we go any further, though, I want you to put me on pause and watch the two videos that I've got linked in this lesson's description. They're very short little YouTube videos, and they're going to tell you what these acronyms stand for in these two different models of using technology in education. So put me on pause and then come back. So let's unpack TPAC. TPAC stands for Technology, Pedagogy, and Content Knowledge, and they represented it in the video very effectively with circles. Okay. And when you get these three circles overlapping, when your content knowledge, your knowledge of how to teach, and your knowledge of how to use technology overlaps, that's the TPAC sweet spot and where you want to be. Because you know what it is that you have to teach, you know your information, you know how to use your strategies to reach your students and how tech is going to enhance it. So I'm going to clarify this with an example from my own teaching. Let's say I needed to give students content, historical information, background information to help them understand their study of Macbeth. I know from many years of doing it that I need to find ways to make it interesting and relevant. And I thought rather than have them passively sitting and listening to me do a lecture, I could create an interactive website for accessing the information. So I came up with this one. It's a Google Sites website, and they have some very intuitive templates that you can use that basically the websites just build themselves. You have to input the images and the content and the videos, but they're really slick and easy to use. And I'm going to give you information on how to do it. But let's just sit back for a second and watch another video I have embedded here that explains how my website works. Hello, I'm just going to give you a quick tour of the website that I created using Google Sites, which is a very intuitive, easy to use website builder. So this site would be something that I would use to give students background information for the play. It took me some time to set it up, but once it's set up, I can use it forever because this is not information that's going to change. It's already centuries old, right? So I created my header, and my first introduction on the website is, why are we studying a 400-year-old play anyway? Which is something I would normally do in my lecture. So students would be using this site as a replacement for a traditional lecture. So they start by looking, they click through the slideshow, and it's going to take them to a YouTube video that they can click on and watch. Okay, so we don't have to continue there. So then they can go to the background page. And here's where I try to make it a little bit more relevant. Instead of introducing like just the characters or the people that influence Macbeth, I call them the influencers, because that's something that students are going to be able to relate to. And it says there were no influencers during Shakespeare's time, but there were certainly some people who were a strong influence on his writing, and so forth. And then we've got our image of Queen Elizabeth, King James I, and Holinshed, and they can get the information there. Now, the other interesting thing is I found a podcast that has some really good information on King James I and his um, involvement and interest in witchcraft. He was not involved in witchcraft, but quite interested in it. So the students can also click on there and listen to the podcast, and it gives them a task that they have to do. And then I've got background information on witchcraft, again, an embedded video that the students can watch. Okay. And then I've got information on gender roles in the play. And this was just something I was using to show students how my slideshows were going to work for my Macbeth unit that I do. But you can see how you can click through, and I highlight important parts of a quotation and include questions or include an explanation. And so they can just click through and get the information that they need about Banquo. And if I was building more of this site, I would have more characters built in. But basically, this is just to give you an introduction to how you can use a website to present information in a way that is much more in the format that our students are used to looking at online. Hope that helps. Okay, so I think you get the idea there, right? It's a much more interactive way for students to get the information and in a format that they are used to using on a daily basis, rather than just sitting and listening to us, no matter how lovely our voices might be. So, once again, when you can find that sweet spot, you're using technology well. And I like this analogy of the three-cornered stool. If you're missing one of these legs, then the lesson isn't as great. Let's move on to SAMR. So SAMR, again, is an acronym that stands for substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. And according to the video, when you are down here, you're enhancing education, and up here, you're transforming it. With substitution, you're using things in a new way. Again, classic example, using the smartboard instead of an overhead projector, or using Google Docs and slides and Google Classroom for writing and assignments. You might also be using technology just because it's what is required in your school, so there's not a lot of intention there. One thing that we can aim for is using technology to create new and different learning experiences. And again, in order to engage our 21st century students, ways that they are used to using these. So again, with substitution, going from handwriting to typing is a huge improvement, right? Especially for those of us who lived through this age period or time period. We can augment the experience by using the tools in Google Classroom for peer editing and for our own feedback. And that's a huge functional improvement on how we do things, because we can do things a lot faster and easier. Here's an example of a modification or a task redesign I did. Instead of writing your typical research essay, I had students do all of the skills that they needed to do. They needed to focus, organize, find valid sources, use in-text citations, quotations, paraphrase, works cited, you know the deal. And they had to present it in, again, similar order that they would in the essay, but in this format that was a whole lot more interesting for them to do and for me to read. So they included images, embedded videos, bullets, charts, things like that that got the information across. And they still had to do the in-text citations and the works cited. This is an example of how I did it using handouts that I would typically give students. Okay, so you can use Google Slides and embed videos. So they get the information that you want to put in written form, but you can also put a short little video in there just to make it a little bit more interactive and a little bit more interesting for them. And again, I'm going to give you a handout that's going to show you how you can do this. But when they clicked on it, there's a video here from John Green's crash course explaining how to figure out if a website is credible or not. Hold on. Bye. Okay, so again, this was a task redesign because I'm doing the same old thing, but in a new and interesting and transformative way. And this is an example of how I got my students to explore theme, starting with the topic and the ideas that were used to develop the topic, and they had to include images and whatnot. You've seen things like this before where they use social media to analyze character or theme. Again, I will give you some ideas for how to do that. With redefinition, you're doing a task that couldn't be done before. And I always kind of wonder about this because I couldn't do this when I was in high school. Okay. I couldn't do this when I started teaching. So it's, in a way, it's redefinition. But according to the video, it's when you connect with others, communicate with the world, or you publish something online for others to see. And when you do that, it becomes a much more authentic task, right? If they're trying to persuade people and instead of a persuasive essay, they create a website that goes out there in the world, then again, it's redefinition. So with this, you ask yourself, am I doing old things in a new way? And again, there's not necessarily anything really wrong with that because it is better. It is a huge improvement. But again, what we're looking at here is ways to engage our 21st century learners, right? So if we can find things that push them above that line, you might get more engagement. With this whole model, you don't have to get too bent into shape about which area that you are floating around in, but you should be more reflective about what you're doing. So what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And how is it helping learning? The names and the categories aren't that important. And as the video said, it's not necessarily a ladder that you're going up because one is higher than the other. It's more like that swimming pool. Okay, sometimes you're wading around in the shallow end and sometimes you're in the deep end and you go back and forth. Okay, but what matters is that we're not always stuck down here in the shallow end. And that we're intentional in the way we're using tech and we're not creating these situations where students are not getting the variety and the freedom that they want and crave. All right, so we talked about how we're going to use this to teach 21st century students, not just as a replacement. Okay, use it so you can use the dictionary and the thesaurus, word processing and research. All of those things are important, okay, and still a very useful use of technology. But this is something that these kids do all the time, so it's not going to push up that engagement factor. But if you can find ways to make these tools enhance your learning, it will be more engaging. And using the tools in a way that they're used to, again, like this, they go onto a website, they're able to interact with it. Again. All right, this is a video that I created and I'm not quite sure why it's not playing, but I will figure it out because it's going to also be in the multimodal assignment things. All right, so you want to make sure that you are not just using technology to entertain and to engage, but they're using it to educate your students. It's not just flashy and fun, but they're for a purpose. If you get your students engaged in and engaged with the task they're doing, you will be educating them and learning will be happening, okay? So it's not just one tool in your teacher, it's just one tool in your teacher toolbox. And your students are going to need a variety of learning activities, and we're going to